Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the League of Women Voters of Greenville County's talk on the racial politics of public education, a topic that addresses both education and topics surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion in America. I'm Susan Bell, and I'm the president of the Greenville League. I recognize a lot of faces from our local league and from leagues across the state, so we appreciate you being with us today. We work to increase understanding of major societal issues and to influence public policy through education and advocacy. For those of you who are new to the league, we want to reinforce that we do not support or oppose political parties or candidates. We do, however, promote stances, one being our support of local, state, and federal policies that provide an equitable, quality public education for all children pre-K through grade 12. Now to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Holly A. Pinheiro, Jr., is an assistant professor of African American history in the Department of History at Furman University. This is our second opportunity to hear Dr. Pinheiro, and we're very excited to have him back with us today. His research focuses on the intersectionality of race, gender, and class in the military from 1850 through the 1920s. With a similar focus of today's talk. Counter to the national narrative, which championed the patriotic manhood of soldiering from the Civil War through the 1920s, his research reveals that African American veterans and their families' military experience were much more fraught. Economic and social instability introduced by military service resonated for years and even generations after soldiers left the battlefield. Dr. Pinheiro has published articles in edited volumes in academic journals in and outside of the United States. His manuscript, The Family Civil War, Black Soldiers and the Fight for Racial Justice, and we've put a link to his book in the chat if you're interested in that. Highlights how racism in and outside of military service impacted the body's economic, family, and social spaces of African Americans long after the war ended. His book has received, rave reviews in the LA Review of Books and the Civil War Book Review. It has received an honorable mention in the Civil War Monitor for the best Civil War book of 2022. He's also started preliminary work for a new monograph that will examine all Pennsylvania-born soldiers who trained at Camp William Penn. He's had advanced conversations with University of North Carolina Press to have the book under advanced contract this year. And he's also been interviewed by the History Channel, NPR, Defense One, Curiosity Streams, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and he's a senior editor for Black Perspectives. In today's talk, The Racial Politics of Public Education, Dr. Pinheiro will be discussing how various issues surrounding race, gender, and class have had profound impact on public education throughout American history. He plans to highlight several historical moments where different historically marginalized groups routinely fought against discriminatory policies and actions that meant privileged public education to a segment of society. Additionally, the talk will highlight how these groups across multiple generations fought for equality and accessibility in public education. Dr. Pinheiro, welcome. Are you ready to begin?
Yes, thank you all, especially during a lunchtime. I understand how precious time is, and just thank you so much. I'm going to jump. All right. So given our socio-political environment, where various individuals at PTA and even school board meetings, to numerous politicians making educational reforms staples of their campaigns, one might speculate that public education is pushing agendas. To be clear, the purpose of my presentation is not to wade into that discourse, as I am not a scholar of modern United States history. Instead, I will provide some historical context to the evolving and often racially discriminatory policies and practices in secondary and some collegiate public education systems throughout the 19th and up to the mid 20th century. These are a few examples that I will cover, and while not universal experiences, they do, I believe, collectively illustrate that various people and institutions use public education as ways of oppressing multiple groups of people, often to promote patriarchy and white supremacy as normal within American society. So this first section I want to highlight is actually portions of my book, which Susan was very kindly enough to note, The Family Civil War. Feel free to check it out. So just for context, this is actually talking about these Civil War, Black Civil War soldiers and their families long before the Civil War officially began. So I'm calling this one Familial Decisions Concerning Children's Education. So from 1850 into 1863, at least 28 of the 50 boys that I studied in the book as young children, whose educational status could be confirmed, went to school, while many others did not. School attendance as a child was not a universal experience for many African-American Philadelphians or even Northerners in the mid-19th century. Less than 60% of 4,000 reported school-age African-American children in that city were in school in 1856. Perhaps some of these future soldiers were students in what was also known as the Institute for Colored Youth, which is a very important African-American educational institution connected to basically the who's who of abolitionists, men and women. Others might have studied at institutions affiliated with local African-American churches, including the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, which is the first Black church in the United States. Educating children was an important issue for many African-Americans. Northern newspapers such as the National Era emphasized that intellectual growth might improve future generations' social, political, and economic standing. For example, also Jacob C. White Jr., a Philadelphian student and future supporter of the USET regiments or United States Colored Troop regiments, championed the importance of scholastic endeavors during a May 24th, 1855 visit by then Pennsylvania Governor James Pollock. White professed that African-American students needed the resources that would make them equal to whites to succeed. He then informed the Pennsylvania governor that imposing racial segregation in public schools denied Black children equal opportunities. He said, quote, "For you see us, sir," White stated, "a little family by ourselves set off from another youth in this great commonwealth and in common brotherhood," end quote. His criticism came 1 year after the Pennsylvania state legislature passed a law stating that public schools with over 20 Black students must segregate. White wanted the governor to understand that ending racial segregation in public schools would show others intellectual equality was capable amongst all children. White claimed that public schools were an ideal training ground for defining African-American citizenship, particularly for boys and later young men. He argued, quote, "We are nevertheless preparing ourselves usefully for a future day when citizenship in our country will be based on manhood and not color," end quote. For White, preparation for citizenship began long before adulthood, and his gendered beliefs privileged men and unfortunately ignored women. Pollock remained silent on both issues, indicating that his focus of the visit was more on public relations and less on the actual experiences and aspirations for citizenship for African Americans. Meanwhile, adult African Americans in the North openly complained about racially discriminatory policies that put their children into public schools that were inferior, unfortunately, in nearly every way to white schools. Northern clergy members, parents, and community members lamented how African American schools continuously dealt with overcrowding, underfunding, dilapidated buildings, and a high turnover of faculty and administrators. Even with these problems, some African Americans still believe that public schools served a larger purpose for the youth's intellectual elevation. For example, an 1863 article for the Christian Recorder, which is a newspaper collected to the AME Church, espoused that an African American public school was better at intellectually developing pupils, even with the fewer resources than white schools. And they wrote, quote, "The high school for colored youth in 717 Lombard Street is a bad location with very limited accommodations. Its curriculum will compare well with any high school in this city. We invite comparison." Finding quality Philadelphian teachers, unfortunately, remained on the minds of Northern African American newspapers throughout the mid-19th century. In Jane Porter's eulogy, the Douglas Monthly, connected to Frederick Douglass, praised a white teacher's passionate work educating African American children in an openly racist and violent city. Porter's death depressed local African Americans who understood that they had only a few local white allies. Quote, "Her death is deeply lamented by many families outside of those of her immediate relations," quote, the article stated. Sadly for African American students, other white teachers were not as caring. As a Miss Donnelly of the colored public school on 6th Street received sharp criticism from the Christian Recorder for her offensive tone, towards Black students, and the paper advocated for her removal. The anonymous author noted that Miss Donnelly showed, quote, "a hatred and prejudice against us," end quote, that raised concern within the local community. The author stated that if Miss Donnelly continued to teach, and African American families would, quote, "break up the school by preventing our children from going, and we will do it rather than have our children taught by such a teacher." End quote. Perhaps Miss Donnelly took the job to accomplish a self-appointed role as a savior to African American children. It is also plausible that her primary concern was about earning money. Regardless, both examples reveal that African American Philadelphian children interacted with an assortment of educators, which possibly influenced their parents' decision whether to or not send them to a public school. Now, the Institute for Colored Youth, meanwhile, allowed local children to receive a different type of scholastic experience. The school's curriculum included foreign languages and mathematics taught by men and women faculty. Teacher advertisements made it clear that African Americans were the ideal candidates. Quote, we hope one will be found, as there are many of those among our people who are amply qualified," end quote, the Frederick Douglass paper noted. Students attending the ICY had the privilege of learning amongst influential abolitionists that included Sarah Mapps Douglas and Octavius Cotto, just to name a few. Therefore, African American children had differing educational experiences depending on which institutions they were attending. African American abolitionists worked in racially segregated public schools as well. For instance, Junius C. Morrill was the principal of the Colored School No. 2 in Weeksville, New York. In summation, Black children conceivably learned from, or at least interacted with, some abolitionists while acquiring an education in a public or even a private Northern school. The ICY, meanwhile, sought to provide practical vocational training and prepare pupils to work in professions beyond labor. The school prided itself on training and graduating 5 new teachers in 1861, whom the school believed should begin work at the 6th Street Colored School. Therefore, becoming an ICY student could provide upward socioeconomic mobility for a new generation of African Americans while simultaneously fighting against racism through their employment. And the sending of African American children to school was a significant decision for every Northern family, especially for the working poor, who relied on every individual, sometimes children as young as 5 years old, to contribute to their household finances. Willingly removing potential child laborers from employment opportunities to supplement their homes was a hard choice, as Kim weighed their immediate needs against the possible long-term benefits of intellectual growth and racial betterment. Many African abolitionists believed that the lasting growth and progress mattered more than familial finances. Ultimately, for mothers, they were the ones that had the ultimate decision on whether a school-age child would find work or not. And I'd also like to note that one of the soldiers that I studied in my book will say when he's in his 90s that the thing he remembers most is not his Civil War military experience, but the fact that he was unable to attend school as a child in Philadelphia because of racial discrimination, which forced him, when he was 6 years old, to find work. And that, to me, was profound, that he wanted the federal government to know that. His record. Now, during the antebellum era, at least two Civil War future soldiers split their time between being a student and finding regular wage earning employment. George M. Shorter and Francis Hawkins not only went to school, but still found time to work. In Hawkins' case, he intermittently left school to supplement his household economy, possibly as a laborer, since his grandmother's income as a whitewasher was not enough to provide for their entire family. While Hawkins' family's material realities necessitated Francis' removal from school, they never ended his aspirations for receiving a public education, as he would continue to attend school intermittently. Meanwhile, George M. Shorter and his brother John also went to school, but worked as for an engine fireman for the African Fire Association, or the AFA, a group of racially segregated local fire companies that focused their efforts on protecting African Americans. The formation and the continuance of the AFA occasionally led to moments of racial violence by local white firemen. Racist whites desired to establish a monopoly and deter competition, which they perceived as the devaluation of their worth as white men. Therefore, the Shorter brothers' employment may have given their family economic stability, but it simultaneously threatened their safety and ultimately their lives, along with questioning the pursuits of their potential academic endeavors. As children, 5 of the 55 school-age future soldiers in the Civil War worked as either a servant, errand boy, farm laborer, waiter, or even a cabinet. This collection of jobs illustrates that these adolescent African American boys were able to sometimes find semi-skilled and skilled occupations when African American men were unable to do so at the exact same time. Now, the circumstances for their employment differed greatly for each of these children. For instance, Richard Carter resided with the Edisons, a white family, and they had a total of 9 individuals living in that home. Nathan Edison was a wealthy white cabinet maker and had 5 of his apprentices, including Carter, living with his family. Now, Carter's employment was rare since he worked a skilled trade, and his cohabitation provided another instance of an interracial household amid an era in which Philadelphia had some of the worst large-scale race massacres in American history. And just for context, Philadelphia, there was the 1834, 1838, 1842, 1844, and 1876 race massacres. That was the normal life for African Americans living or even navigating through that city, including many of the future soldiers that I study in my book and their families. 58 children, including the siblings and fictive kin of future USCT soldiers, attended school between 1850 and 1863. Their attendance was split nearly evenly amongst boys and girls. And deciding to have girls attend school illustrates a historical moment of transition when many Americans began embracing girls' education, even as some people remained tied to an older belief. The Christian Recorder published an article arguing that a young woman must place more value on their domestic duties than schooling. And they wrote, quote, "A knowledge of books is certainly important, but your young daughter should receive a proper home training, which is more important for her future well-being," end quote, the article asserted. In the anonymous author's opinion, learning how to cook, clean, repair clothes, and practice fiduciary frugality encompassed the necessary life training that girls needed to find a potential mate. Being a learned woman was not seen as a universally appealing trait, according to this article. Boys, on the other hand, were told to focus themselves on academic pursuits. Thus, there was a clear gendered dynamic on the value of education in Northern antebellum African American newspapers as it relates to public education. And yet, some of these working poor African American Philadelphian families prioritized their children's scholastic endeavors in the hope of improving their future. And now I'm going to transition to highlighting what is happening in the 19th century for some indigenous children. So the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, operated from 1879 until about 1918. This school was converted from an old military barracks that was founded by Richard Henry Pratt a captain in the US Army. He was the first person, at least recorded in 1902, to use the word racism. Pratt believed that education would play a pivotal role in the acculturation process for Native American children. And he said, quote, "I believe in immersing Indians in our civilization, and when we get them under our holding there until they are thoroughly soaked, kill the Indian to save the man," end quote. The curriculum at this institution consisted of classes on reading, writing, arithmetic in the mornings, and learning a trade in the afternoons. Boys learned carpentry or blacksmithing. Girls learned domestics such as sewing, cooking, and cleaning. Unfortunately, children were forced to give up their indigenous names, and they were renamed with white Christian names. Instead of being named either Eagle Dog, his name was Charles. This process ignored the cultural and familial tradition of each name. It also argued that white educators' authority superseded parental authority. Sadly, deaths were also very common at this school, and many children became ill and died due to the spread of disease, such as tuberculosis and even smallpox, that the children's immune systems had not been exposed to. At least 175 children were buried at the school cemetery, and a larger number of undocumented were never sent home to their families. Physical abuse was also common as a tool at this institution that was used against children for violating some of the following offenses: refusing to give up their native name and acknowledge their Christian name, not adopting the Christian religion and giving up their native religious practices, not adopting a Christian style of dress, that being boys wearing military uniforms and girls wearing Victoria-era dresses. Both wore shoes rather than moccasins or a haircut. And to be clear, for many indigenous people, such as the Lakota, the cutting of one's hair was a symbolic act that was meant to represent the mourning of something. And so cutting one's hair was absolutely horrific, especially when it was being done violently, forcefully. Students not speaking or understanding English, or even attempting to run away, which that happened quite a bit. Students were also forced to put in hard labor, forced to have their mouths washed out with lye and being held down, and have their hair forcibly removed. This school was a boarding school where children were also forcefully separated from their families, living in unknown areas, and having their cultural identity stripped away from them, where they witnessed abuse and death. And as I lecture with my students, many of these indigenous families actually gave up guardianship of the children to the federal government through this process. And it's horrific, and I'm happy to provide some resources, including some of the individuals who survived this institution, if you'd like to actually read and learn from firsthand what that was like for these children. In a completely different location, but around the same period of time, African Americans in the post-Reconstruction era are also dealing with hardships as it relates to public education. One case I want to talk about specifically is the United States Supreme Court case of Cummings v. Richmond County Board of Education in 1899. This case focused on Georgia's state constitution, which stated that the Board of Education must create racially segregated schools that would be established through state taxes. The Board of Education taxed locals for $45,000 towards supporting the education in primary, intermediate, high school, and grammar schools. African American Georgians would sue the Board of Education on the basis that there were minimal opportunities for their children to attend secondary schools, more specifically high schools, while white children had no problems. More specifically, Ware High School for African American students was closed due to a lack of financing and converted into 4 elementary schools. For context, if you're not familiar with Richmond County, that's literally where the Masters is. Plaintiffs argued that it was illegal that they were required by state law to pay for school that their children were barred from attending. The Board of Education argued that instead of having Ware High School, African American students should attend private sectarian schools, including Payne Institute or Payne College, the Walker Baptist, Haynes Industrial School, amongst others. Plaintiffs argued that these decisions violated the basis of Plessy v. Ferguson's separate but equal. The plaintiffs won the initial case, and the Richmond County representatives appealed to the Georgia State Supreme Court. it was reversed with that decision. This led the plaintiffs to take the case to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court held Georgia's state Supreme Court's ruling, arguing that it was the state's right to decide on public education policies for children. Now, here is one of the justices' quotes on this ruling. Quote, "The education of people in schools maintained by state taxation is a matter belonging to these representative states. And any interference on the part of federal authority with the management of such schools cannot be justified except in the case of a clear and unmistakable disregard of rights secured by the supreme law of the land." End quote. And I'll just add, I've taught that section in that case for years. And then one day when I was teaching at Augusta University, my previous place of employment, it dawned on me that I was working and teaching in Richmond County. And then my students and I started to unpack the legacy of that ruling and how there are still evident issues of not only racial, but like economic discrimination. And it is still very pervasive. And I tell you this knowing firsthand that there are some great students in Richmond County, but who are still struggling with the ramifications of that ruling. Now, turning to somewhat of connecting to that point about Black higher education. African Americans did not sit silently and tolerate racism within American society, particularly as it relates to education. African Americans throughout the Midwest, Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and South established historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, to provide Black men and women, but even boys and girls, with access to education. HBCUs did not originate in the late 19th century. In many instances, they began in the early 19th century. For example, Cheyenne Institute of Pennsylvania was founded in 1837. The Lincoln University of Pennsylvania was founded in 1854. The Wilberforce University of Ohio was founded in 1856. And Harriet Stowe State University in St. Louis, Missouri was founded in 1857. However, as the Jim Crow laws became hardline policies throughout the nation, African Americans sought to establish even more schools. So from 1865 until 1899, 83 more HBCUs will be founded and operated with the explicit purposes of providing African American men and women, but even some children, access to either a college or a high school degree. And this is also something that is near and dear to my heart, having previously worked at an HBCU, and that being Alabama University in Huntsville. Education mattered to African Americans, especially in the late 19th century, because of numerous state laws that were making it illegal for African Americans to receive an education. For instance, North Carolina state legislature had passed a law in 1831 outlawing the teaching of enslaved people to read or write, when they said, quote, "that any free person who shall after teach or attempt to teach any slave within the state to read or write or to use figures accepted or shall give or sell such a slave or slave any books or pamphlets shall be liable to indictment in a court in this state having jurisdiction thereof, and upon conviction shall at the discretion of the court, if a white man or woman, shall be fined no less than $100 and no more than $200 or in prison. And if a free person of color shall be fined, imprisoned, or whipped at the discretion of the court, that not exceeding 30 lashes nor less than 20 lashes." And as I tell my students, it was literally illegal to know how to read and write. Right? And the legacy of that persisted long after the Civil War. And this is even seen in South Carolina, where there are many reports of formerly enslaved people fighting, clamoring, that's the better word, to be near a school, to have the privilege to learn how to write their name, to be able to write a relative name that is no longer alive. That's how important it was, just for the legacy of memory, to be seen as a human being. After the Civil War, access to education became more feasible, and African Americans, particularly formerly enslaved people, saw education as proof of their newly acquired rights. Furthermore, education was seen as a pathway for citizenship and hopeful socioeconomic upward mobility. The curriculum of these schools paralleled many white colleges and universities, offering degrees in law, medicine, accounting, mathematics, history, philosophy, Latin, hard sciences, and other programs, which allowed them to transition, hopefully, into white-collar professions and skilled trades, thus negating the popular idea that African Americans were uneducated and ignorant who worked unskilled, physically laborious jobs, and that's all they were good. During this period of blossoming African American education, there was vital debate ongoing within the Black community as to what the purpose of education should be. Essentially, what should the curriculum? You had, on one hand, Booker T. Washington, who was formerly enslaved, who after the war paid for his education while working as a janitor. And he believed an industrial education would teach Black people to apply themselves immediately into a trade that would make them indispensable to the land. Moreover, it would help to ease what he thought tensions between whites and African Americans. Many viewed his approach, which was considered to be an accommodationist, answered the realities of Black life in a non-threatening manner. On the other hand, was W.E.B. Du Bois, who emphatically disagreed with Washington's view because it perpetuated, in his opinion, racial segregation, while Du Bois wanted to use education to create a social political activism with what he called his talented ten. And he said, quote, "Now the training of men is a difficult and intricate task. Its technique is a matter for educational experts, but its object is for visions of seers. If we make money, the object is man training. We shall develop money makers, but not necessarily men. If we make technical skill the object of education, we may possess artisans, but not in nature men. Men we shall have only if we make manhood the object of the work of schools, intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world that was and is, and of the relation of men to it. This is the curriculum of higher education, which must underline true life. Of this foundation, we may build breadwinning skill of hand and quickness of brain, with never a fear lest the child and man mistake the means of living of the object of life." End quote. Though critiques of Du Bois were varied because of his aggressive tactics, and to be clear, he was very elitist in his terms of intellectualism. And I promise I'm nearly done. I wanted to turn very briefly to highlighting the modern issues of, and I say modern in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, of racism with public education. African American women in the modern civil rights movement, and I'm happy to talk about that phrasing. That's something I and other scholars are trying to tease out more, came from varying backgrounds and occupations from the North and South, and from rural and urban areas. They represented a vast age range, with some highly educated and others with little formal schooling. Some women were new recruits to the movement, and others were decades-long veterans. Women such as Joanne Gibson Robinson and Joni had worked in various civil rights and reform groups in Montgomery, Alabama since the 1940s, and both women played critical roles in the day-to-day operations of the Montgomery bus boycott. And if anyone's interested, I had the privilege of listening to Fred Gray, who was the lead attorney for the Montgomery boycott. And it was truly inspirational to hear someone who was sitting in the room when they were discussing who should lead the boycott, and that they came to Dr. King Jr. It's surreal that these people are still with us. Privileged to hear them talk. The NAACP branch president in 1950s, Daisy Bates, began her fight against racial injustice as a journalist in the 1940s. Bates assisted the Little Rock Nine in preparation for their integration at Central High School in 1957, conducting strategy sessions in her home. The movement women left no singular type of legacy, but played various roles throughout the 1950s and 60s. Black women were the initiators in desegregation of state universities at the undergraduate level. The first such effort was made by Authorin Lucy at the University of Alabama in 1956. Her story, it's really home for me because I worked at the University of Alabama. And after I tell this story, I do want to close with something about her very important legacy. Bama was ordered to admit her, but the students and white townspeople of Tuscaloosa resorted to violence to prevent her from attending. Even with heavy police escort and in the company of the Dean of Women, her car was pelted with stones, and some people even jumped on top of it. She was suspended because of the rioting. She accused the university officials of conspiring to keep her out of the university. Having worked at Bama, one thing I learned is that they actually had to shuttle her through an underground tunnel to get her to and from classes. which to me is absolutely appalling. And she was finally, after generations of advocacy, recognized by the university for exactly what I'm talking about. And they had a public event for her this year, and she died a few days after that event. She was there, and many people who knew her said that it was evident to them that she was holding out for the university to finally apologize for what they had done. And that we need to recognize that the trauma that these and other people experience stays with them. And it's important that we amplify their stories and never forget. Meanwhile, the first successful integration at a public university, that being the University of Georgia, was accomplished by a woman, Charlene Hunter, and a man, Hamilton Holmes. These two waged a war, a legal battle for admission to UGA, and they would eventually enter in the fall of 1961 under court order amid a crowd of white students shouting racial epithets. Over the next 2 days, whites burned crosses, formed a mob outside of Hunter's dormitory, and it would ultimately take the state patrolmen and tear gas to subdue them. And lastly, but not least, I wanted to make a local connection, at least to South Carolina, that being Septima Clark. She had moved to Johns Island off of South Carolina's coast to teach reading skills to illiterate adults and children who worked as sharecroppers and farmers. The experience led her to question the disparities between schools for Black and white children, and also between the salaries for Black and white teachers. Returning to Charleston, she actively supported the NAACP's efforts to hire in 1918 and 1919 Black teachers to public schools in Charleston. She would also go door to door, obtaining signatures for a petition, which ended successfully in the hiring of more Black teachers. In the mid-1940s, she had even formed part of a successful class action suit for the equalization of teachers' pay in South Carolina. Unfortunately, in 1956, she lost her teaching job because of her membership in the NAACP. But her beliefs and principles for which she fought for sustained her through these dark periods of intimidation. Thank you.
That was great, Dr. Pinheiro. We do have a couple of questions, if you've still got a few minutes left. So here's one. It seems that we are still having these conversations today, especially in the approval of curriculum for history classes. How can we help ensure accurate history is taught?
That's a great question. I'll say what I say to my students. Be engaged, even if one doesn't have kids. Because like for me, it's having a 4-month-old daughter. I'm going to be very much engaged, like what is being taught in the curriculum. And that includes going to a school board meeting, going to a PTA meeting. But I'd also say, and part for me was like supplementing what students are learning in and outside of class. Because so for me, a lot of what I learned was my family was very passionate. My uncles, I'll never forget, had me reading Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X's biographies when I was 8 years old. And I'm not saying I understood everything that I was reading, but I understood that they said, you need to learn your history. And I've tried my best to do that in the classroom and to ask students, what have you been taught? Is this the first time you've learned this? Most times the answer is yes. And they've expressed frustration. And some of these students are local to Greenville County or the surrounding areas and have said, why did I have to come to Furman to hear these stories, these local histories even? And I said, the best way to go about changing that is to be actively engaged and to supplement. I know there's a lot of messiness, and I am not a scholar of public education enough to know the nuances of it, but I would just say it's being aware of what's taught and more importantly, what's not taught. I'm not sure if y'all have even seen in Virginia, there was a recent debate about removing Dr. King Jr. From public education, secondary education, particularly like middle and elementary schools. And I asked that to my students. I said, what do you take of that, removing him? And one of my students who is from this area, she said, I'm horrified, but probably not for what you're thinking. And she said, what I'm horrified is if you're going after him, like one of like the most well-known, what about everyone else that's not as well-known? And I said, that's exactly where my mind goes. If you're going after someone like him, what does that mean for someone? And I'm not trying to dismiss Septima Clark or any of these other people, but there are so many others that are just going to get left by the wayside. And I even think when I was a student in high school, my high school, I think my junior year, we're learning about we learned about Dr. King Jr. and Rosa Parks. And I asked my high school teacher, what about Malcolm X? And he said, well, he's controversial. And I said, why? And I asked him, have you ever read anything that he's written? And he said, no. I said, so how do you know what he is? I said, he actually went to Mecca and saw that anyone could practice the Muslim faith. And so he wasn't anti-white, he was pro-Black, especially given the historical normalization of Black people not even being seen as human beings. That is the world that he was raised in. And so once I did that, I realized that even some of the educators didn't know. And so for me, it lit a fire. And so I would just say it's, being engaged, listening, asking questions, take a look at what's a social studies book right now, saying even about women's history. Because for me, I'm scared to see what it's going to say when my daughter's in the class. Like, how are women the central focus of American history or global history? I don't know. But if they're not, I'm going to make sure my daughter knows that and is saying it in class all the time.
Thank you. Here's another. Is there any benefit to having Black students have classes with other Black students, or more benefit to having integrated classrooms in schools today?
I guess the simple answer for me is like the classes should reflect the population of the community. If it is a diverse community, then it should be reflected as such. If the community is not, then the classroom should be reflected as such. I've had it all different ways. I went to public schools that were extremely diverse. I've also taught at HBCU that was predominantly African American, though there were some white students that went there. For me, I think it's like giving content that sees the diversity of the population. Because for me, what I am usually disappointed is why is not even just a Black student, why is a student coming into a class and let's say this is the first time they're learning women's history in a way that centers on women as essential historical figures. It shouldn't have to be a class that's at a women's college, for example. It shouldn't have to be in a women, gender, sexuality studies or the AP courses. It should be starting as early as they're able to understand, right, that people matter and that people's history is diverse. And that includes recognizing Indigenous people's history. Part of that story too.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, you're good.
Last question. Considering the historical context you've laid out, what are some of the things you think voters should be keeping in mind when it comes to public education?
Oh, yeah. Ooh, professorial answer or the personal? All right, so I would just say this, and obviously this audience would be keen to this, is just paying attention to all the different elections, and that includes the local, because education should not be weaponized. It should not, but the thing that I roll my eyes when I hear people say it is that there's this shock, but it's always been there in this country's history. So to me, it's not new. It's ever evolved. Because the one that, for me, that I emphasize to my students is talking about the Women's Ku Klux Klan in Indiana running school boards and the horrors of that, right? And so what does that say? That these individuals in the 1910s and 20s were connected to the Klan and they were the ones determining the curriculum. And you can only imagine. And at that point, they're not just anti-Black, as I'm trying to emphasize to my students, they're even saying some white people aren't white enough. And so it's discrimination in ways that should be unfathomable. So I would say, education should be, much like this program, diverse and understand there are many experiences that make us what we are today. And silencing different historical figures to push an agenda it's unfortunate. And I would just say, remain engaged. I'm always hypersensitive to local elections as it relates to school. Because I think to myself, I don't want to hear, I don't want any student, particularly not even ones I interact with, to have to be put into situations, where they're being told your history is inferior, or that you don't matter, or this is the only way to understand whatever period we're talking about. So it obviously it's gone all the way up to presidential elections, but I would say you see it a lot at the local level, at the state level, the county level. So don't just focus oneself on presidential, senatorial. Obviously focus on that. But if you want to know what's happening in your local communities, really read up on those candidates. And I would say ask those candidates explicitly, like, what are your stances on these things? Because I personally chuckle when people talk about CRT, because I'm like, do you even know what it is? Because I'll tell you right now, I don't do it. But people would say, they would label my work as that. And I would say, I'm not a lawyer. Like, CRT is technically a law theory. So what you're really attacking is something that has no relevance to my work. But the obsession with controlling curriculum is historic. And it's something we need to change. And here's the thing, we can change it. That's the positive I would leave with. Like, it's something that is attainable to achieve. And I'll say that from my privilege is that the students are actively engaged. When I lecture on this, like, they are very passionate and they have something to say, and they've been talking about what they could do. And I'll just close with this just to make it hit home. It wasn't until 2017 in the state of Texas where they finally acknowledged that the Civil War was officially about slavery. Prior to that, in public schools, students were being taught that it was about representation and taxation and all this other, not really what it was about. And I had a student when I previously worked at Bama who said, he's not lying, y'all. I just went to school. Like, that's what it was. And I think of that, like the horrors of a Black person being told, no, that's not true. Everything you've been taught is a lie. And that's being normalized in public schools. And what that does to their self is horrific.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Dr.
thank you.
Pinheiro.
Appreciate that.
you.
And over to Susan.
Thank you, Laura. Dr. Pinheiro, thank you so very much for joining us again today. And I especially appreciate the way you answered the questions at the end. You gave us the historical context at the beginning, building up to it, but it really comes down to, okay, so how do we use that information and do something with it? And we've seen a tremendous amount of focus on local school boards and local elections this year and state school board, so it's really kind of been in our face recently. And I would say that it's just more and more justification for being engaged at every level. So I'm hopeful that more of our members will just show up to school board meetings, because that's how you really learn what happens and what's going on. And it's fascinating to attend those meetings and just kind of watch the discussion. So again, thank you so very much for your time today. And we look forward to seeing you again in the near future, I hope, and to meeting your daughter maybe next time. So I wish everybody a very happy holiday. We recorded this and we'll post the recording and send you guys a link to it if you want to review it. And I'm sure, and we put the link to Dr. Pinheiro's book in the chat. So please check that out if you haven't already. Thank you again. Happy holidays. We'll see you in January.